Hello, ladies, gentlemen, and assorted beings. Welcome back to Admiralty Racing. This is the history of the 1952 Formula One World Championship. Although, funnily enough, this year was actually held to Formula 2 regulations. Now, before World War II, that is, the main championship in motor racing was the European Championship, which was dominated by Mercedes-Benz towards its end. The Formula One regulations were created immediately after the war, and the first World Championship was held in 1950 and dominated by Alfa Romeo, with Giuseppe Farina winning the World Championship. In 1951, Fangio took the championship for Alfa Romeo after a close battle with Ferrari and Alberto Ascari. Having defended its title, Alfa Romeo then decided to leave the sport, and that left Ferrari with no serious rivals and a very limited Formula One grid. As a result, the FIA decided to change the World Championship such that its races would be run to Formula 2 regulations for 1952 in an effort to increase the size of the grid, since it was feared less than 10 cars might sometimes show up if they kept it at Formula 1 regulations, and that no one would have a chance against Ferrari. That worked out only so well. For 1952, the schedule underwent a few changes. The French Grand Prix was moved from Reims to Rouen-les-Essarts. I'm just going to assume I'm mangling French pronunciations. Sorry. The Dutch Grand Prix was added at Zandvoort, but that was cancelled out by the Spanish Grand Prix being cancelled due to financial disagreements. So we had an 8-race schedule: Switzerland, the Indianapolis 500, Belgium, France, Britain, Germany, the Netherlands, and Italy. Now, almost nobody from Europe actually went to the Indianapolis 500, but it was the only race outside of Europe, so they needed it to claim world championship status. Now, don't forget, this is still the 1950s. The rules and expectations are still a lot different from the present day. Drivers were still allowed to change cars mid-race or switch cars if they wanted. Nearly all the drivers are gentleman drivers, in the sense not even of paying for their drives, but of literally owning and operating their cars themselves, with the exception of a few factory teams. And the grid changes wildly from race to race, as drivers pretty much come and go as they please, with only a small portion of them actually competing seriously for the whole world championship. Now, the protagonists of 1952. In the absence of Alfa Romeo, the obvious favorites are Scuderia Ferrari, the only major team left. No Maserati or Talbot competing this year either. Well, Maserati were supposed to compete, but their car was not ready at the start of the season. Having been essentially second best to Alfa Romeo 2 years in a row, Ferrari were not about to be left in that position again in 1952. They had the only car that was purpose-built for these regulations ready and complete at the start of the season. A simple and reliable vehicle with a 2-liter naturally aspirated inline-4 engine producing 185 horsepower and running on Pirelli tires, the Ferrari Tipo 500. And driving it, Giuseppe Nino Farina, stolen from Alfa Romeo after, well, not exactly stolen given they'd left the sport, but Farina, a 45-year-old Italian, protege of the pre-war great Nuvolari, long-time Alfa Romeo driver, but his uncle had founded Pininfarina, which is, of course, famous for styling Ferraris and among other cars. He had been world champion in 1950, but in 1951 was only 4th, well behind Fangio, and I believe his new teammate Ascari as well. Let me check. Yes, behind Fangio as well as his new teammate Ascari. So he would be needing to step it up in 1952 if he was going to beat his new opponent, Alberto Ascari, a 33-year-old Italian. His father had died racing in the 1920s. Ascari himself had started in motorcycle racing, somehow survived that, and now drove for Ferrari, a business partner of Luigi Villarizi, who was supposed to be the 4th Ferrari driver, but, well, we'll get to what happened to him later. He's not dead anyway. He had come second in 1951 and taken 2 races, but fell short of the championship. The third full-time Ferrari driver, as it turned out, would be Piero Taruffi, a 45-year-old Italian, once formerly a motorcycle racer. He won the 1951 Carrera Panamericana and was a top-class driver, but probably wouldn't have started ahead of Villarisi except for what happened to Villarisi, unfortunately. He had been 6th in 1951. Now, the closest thing Ferrari had to an opponent was Equipe Gordini, a newly independent French sports car manufacturer, having just ended their partnership with the Italian Simca. With no Talbot, they were the only serious French entrant remaining, and after having very limited success in the previous years, they had the Gordini T16, a new design which they had been building to enter in Formula 2 in 1952. They were caught not as prepared as Ferrari, perhaps, for this becoming the World Championship, but they did have a pretty solid F2 car ready with a 2-liter inline-6 engine, although it produced less than 170 horsepower, which you'll note is pretty much 10% less than Ferrari had. Quite a difference. They ran on Engelbert tires. Now, Gordini's driver lineup consisted of Robert Manzone and Maurice Trintignant, unchanged from the previous year. Manzone, a 35-year-old Frenchman who had been signed up as one of the first Gordini drivers back in 1948 after starting as a mechanic. He had taken 3 points back in 1950, but none in 1951. And Maurice Trintignant, 34-year-old Frenchman who had started racing right before the war, earned the unfortunate nickname of Le Pétulé, or the Rat Droppings Man, due to an incident which caused his retirement in the first race held after the war. He had started 5 races for Gordini in 1950 and 51 and had retired from all of them, mostly through no fault of his own, but, well, time will tell if this could be his year. Their new driver, John Beira, a 31-year-old Frenchman just coming over from motorcycle racing, short, stocky, and known for his fiery temper, but untried in single-seater cars. Now, Maserati, supposed to be, well, Maserati had been the top challenger to Alfa Romeo in the pre-World Championship era of the 1940s. As you can see, 10, 13, and 10 wins in 1947, 48, and 49. But in 1950, they had found themselves totally outclassed by the Alfa Romeo and soon enough by the Ferrari as well, with an aging and outdated design. They were preparing to make a big effort at these newly changed regulations, which, for the record, the old Formula 1 regulations were 4.5-liter naturally aspirated or 1.5-liter supercharged engines. The new Formula 2 regulations required 2-liter naturally aspirated engines, aka effectively less than half the size and power of what they had previously been running with. So Maserati was preparing for these new regulations after scoring 0 points in 1951. But their A6 GCM was not ready for the start of the season and would have a lot of teething troubles still to work out. However, they would have a 2-liter naturally aspirated inline-6 engine which produced about 180 horsepower, by far the closest to Ferrari out of anybody, compared to any of the smaller independent manufacturers. And they had a strong driver lineup. Jose Froilan Gonzalez, third for Ferrari in 1951, had chosen to leave them and join the new Maserati project. Still the youngest serious driver in the field, or sort of full-time driver in the field at age 29, a protege of Fangio. He was nicknamed the Pompous Bull, or less flatteringly El Cabazon, which is fathead. Although that was actually his own Argentine fans who called him that, so... Alongside Felice Bonetto, a 48-year-old Italian who had been a road racer well before the war, nicknamed Il Pirata, the Pirate. He had achieved 8th in 1951, driving mostly as an independent, so it was a strong lineup, but no car at the start of the year. Now, Britain had been pretty much left out of Formula One, odd as that sounds, in 1950 and 51. The Italian manufacturers Ferrari and Alfa Romeo had, well, Alfa Romeo especially, but also Ferrari, had mostly dominated. Maserati had been a theoretical large player, and If anybody else had been around, it had been Gordini or Talbot. There had been a few British cars running around, but really pretty limited. That started to really change this year, and one of the frontrunners of that was Cooper, the largest British race car producer by volume in 1952, previously building mainly Formula 3 cars. However, it just so happened that simultaneous to the World Championship dropping down to F2 regulations, they had launched their bid to expand into Formula 2. Now, they didn't actually have a factory team, and this was their first ever Formula 2 car. Their 2-liter naturally aspirated inline-six only had 130 horsepower and was provided by Bristol, so they did not build it themselves, unlike Ferrari or Maserati or Gordini. But running on Dunlop tires, the Cooper T20, although severely down on power, would prove to be light, simple, and surprisingly effective during the year. Now, although they didn't have a factory team, the main users were 23-year-old Mike Hawthorne of Britain, the son of a high-performance garage owner. This was his first season in single-seaters after some modest success in sports cars in previous years, driving for a team run by his father, Leslie Hawthorne, and, of course, owner of his Cooper as no factory team. Another major driver, Alan Brown, a 32-year-old Brit who had previously spent 2 years as an F3 driver and was taking the step up to F2. He had been a major in the British Army during World War II and then took a job as a truck salesman after the war before deciding to pursue his passion in racing. And aside from Cooper, there are a whole array of small British independent manufacturers who were competing in either F3 or F2, and this year find themselves able to compete in World Championship races surprisingly seriously. HWM with their HWM 52, an Alta 2-liter inline 4 or flat 4 engine. HWM stands for Hersham and Walton Motors. They were a very small garagista team and known for giving young, mostly British talents their first start, including Sterling Moss, who really still hadn't made much impression on the racing world in 1952, except in Formula 3, but was, well, spoilers, but we know he's going to be something in future. Also, Connaught, based out of a sports car garage in Surrey, a regular and very competitive entry in the Formula 2 field in these years, running a Leah Francis 2-liter flat 4 engine with about 165 horsepower. And Fraser Nash, also running the same Bristol engine as Cooper, I believe, a very small volume sports car manufacturer. They'd only built about 50 cars in the last 5 years, and were very poorly financed with no factory team. And yet they did still manage to get the FN48 onto the grid several times during the year. Now, there were a lot of assorted privateer and independent drivers around, as I've mentioned. Rudy Fischer was a 4-year-old Swiss driver, owner of a restaurant and a gentleman racer, leader of the privateer team Escurie Espadon. He had bought a Ferrari 500, Alfa Ferrari, and would drive that for a good part of the season. Now, Luigi Villorisi, 43-year-old Italian, who had once driven for Maserati. His brother had died testing the Alfetta for Alfa Romeo. In 1952, I'm not entirely sure what the arrangement was supposed to be, whether Ferrari intended always to run Ascari, Farina, Taruffi, or whether Villorisi was supposed to have the third seat, but as we'll see, an unfortunate accident would leave him out for a good portion of the year, or very early in the season. And as a result, he would only come back to drive seriously towards the end of the season. Baron Tullio de Graffenried of Switzerland, 38, a gentleman driver as well, owner of a Rolls-Royce Ferrari dealership. He was driving an old... He had not bought a new car, though, and was still driving an old 1948 Maserati with a retrofitted 2-liter Plate engine. And Ken Wharton, a 36-year-old Brit, a fairly successful hill climb and rally driver and owner of a Ford dealership, making his single-seater debut in a privateer Fraser Nash he had just bought. And continuing with these privateers, 35-year-old Dennis Poor of Britain, a financier, owner of Autosport magazine, later chairman of the ill-fated Norton Villiers Triumph motorcycle consortium, driving a Connaught. Eric Thompson, a 32-year-old British insurance broker for Lloyd's of London, two-time class winner of Le Mans. He would become a dealer of rare motorsport books after his active racing career ended, also driving a Connaught. Paul Frere, a 35-year-old Belgian, three-time rowing champion of Belgium. He would be signed up by HWM for his home race at the last minute, and after he stopped racing, he became a noted journalist and literally wrote the book on the Porsche 911. Peter Collins, aged 21, another Brit, son of a garage owner. He had been expelled from school for truancy and started driving in an F3 car bought by his father. He apparently then somehow talked his way into a test with Aston Martin at a party, only to be signed by both them and HWM after they saw his test results. Now, although there's only 8 World Championship races, as I mentioned before, and only the best 4 of those counted for the World Championship, there were a lot of non-championship races still in 1952, which I think play a pretty important part in the story of the season. So the season for most of the drivers really began with the Syracuse Grand Prix on March 16th. No less than 12 Ferraris turned out, including Ascari, Villarizi, Farina, Taruffi, Fischer, and quite a number of others. I mean, it was essentially only Ferraris, and the end result would be that Ascari won ahead of Taruffi, Farina, Fischer, and Peter Whitehead, who was also driving an older independent Ferrari. Villarizi unfortunately retired. That was followed by the Gran Premio del Valentino in Turin, Italy. Again, a largely Ferrari field run to F1 regulations, which really limited the field that could enter, given everyone was focusing on F2 for the World Championship this year. But Farina did appear, along with Ascari, Villarizi, Taruffi, and Fischer once again. BRM attempted to make an entry with Fangio. Oh yes, I never mentioned where Fangio was. Juan Manuel Fangio, reigning Formula One champion, was signed up for BRM. And, well, BRM did not have a Formula 2 car yet. I have to assume they promised him one, but it was not ready, and, well, those of you who have been following previous years of this will know that BRM's development record so far has been dismal. Spoiler, BRM's car will not manifest this year. Fangio was left without a drive, and when he did get a drive, would injure himself pretty early in the season, which took himself out of ended any chance of him switching to another team in order to get a drive. So, a strange season in which the reigning champion is essentially sitting out a year. The result would be a win for Villarizi over Taruffi, Fischer, Whitehead. Ascari finished 5th due to a fuel leak, and Farina retired. Another week later, on April 14th, the Richmond Trophy in Britain at Goodwood would see... This was also run to Formula One regulations, and it would see Gonzalez, still in a Ferrari, take pole, and win, ahead of Mike Hawthorne in his Cooper, Duncan Hamilton in a Talbot. No. Hawthorne would have been... Oh, no, he was in the Cooper, okay. Abacassis in his HWM and Graham Whitehead in an ERA. The very same day, the Pau Grand Prix in France was dominated by the Ferraris, with Ascari winning ahead of Louis Rosier in his privateer Ferrari, and then Beira in a Gordini at least making the podium. And another 2 weeks later, the Grand Prix de Marseille Ferrari showed up, and Ferrari more or less crushed all before them. Ascari won from pole, although a Gordini shared by Prince Bira of Thailand and Robert Manzone managed to get second place, and Claes took third in another Gordini, with Farina and Villarizi both retiring, demonstrating that if nothing else, the Ferrari was most definitely not bulletproof. The sort of pre-season season continued with the British Racing Drivers Club International Trophy at Silverstone. And to some surprise, Robert Manzone was able to take pole ahead of Fischer, Hawthorne, Beira, and Tony Rolt due to the fact that the Ferraris chose not to show up on British home turf. Well, several Ferraris did, Fischer, Peter Whitehead, and others, but the Ferrari factory team didn't put in an appearance, and in their absence, after the retirements of Manzone, Beira, and Hawthorne, aka two Gordinis and Hawthorne in his Cooper, it was Lance Macklin and Tony Rolt in their HWMs that took a 1-2 ahead of de Graffenried in his obsolete Maserati. The very next day was the Gran Premio di Napoli, which was what the Ferraris had skipped the British Racing Drivers' Club trophy for. Farina, Taruffi took a 1-2 in qualifying and a 1-2 in the race ahead of, well, another Ferrari and a Stangualini driven by a certain Giuseppe Rossi. Finally, having seen a preseason largely dominated by Ferrari, except where it failed to actually show up or where it broke down, we make our way to the Swiss Grand Prix at Bremgarten on the 18th of May. Now, Bremgarten had been built back in 1931 in a forest near Bern as a motorcycle racing track. It was all high-speed, tree-lined, a very uneven changing surface. It had been on the schedule since 1950, and in 51 it had been won by Fangio for Alfa Romeo, although he had no chance of repeating. There were some 22 entrants arriving for the race, 7 Ferraris, 4 Gordinis, and 4 HWMs, a pair of Coopers, a pair of Maseratis, a Fraser Nash, and also 1 Veritas and 1 AFM from Germany. Interestingly, Alberto Ascari wasn't present. He skipped the race in order to become the first European F1 driver to seriously enter the Indy 500. And Luigi Villarici, intended to be one of the Ferrari drivers, was now out due to a road car crash, which would leave him out for the better part of the season. Although they starting him in non-championship races against fairly soon, but apparently didn't feel comfortable starting him in championship races until near the end of the season. Maserati intended to enter Gonzalez and had secured an option to start Fangio, but their car wasn't ready, same as Fangio's original option. BRM's car wasn't ready, and so Fangio would find himself not present at the first race of the championship season. Instead, well, it was a collection of Ferraris taking on Gordinis and British independents. Now, qualifying on May 17th, with no Ascari, saw Farina take pole by 2.6 seconds over Taruffi, which, I will note, Farina's time of 2:47.5 was 11.6 seconds slower than the time in 1951, thanks to that huge decrease in engine displacement. Robert Manzone in the Gordini claimed third, 4.6 seconds further behind. On the second row, Andre Simon and Rudi Fischer, both in privateer Ferraris. Fischer being a local Swiss driver, of course. Then Peter Collins in his HWM, John Beira in... Oh, that should be a Gordini, my bad. But anyway, John Beira in his Gordini and Graffenried in his old privateer Maserati. Sterling Moss and George Abakasis in their HWMs. Moss was not a full-time HWM driver this year, but he did show up at this race and won. Prince Bira in his old Gordini, and it was one of the old Gordinis, not the new ones they had for this year. Lance Macklin in his HWM, Ken Wharton in a Fraser Nash. And you'll notice already, these drivers are more than 10 seconds a lap slower than Farina's time. Hans Stuck in an AFM, Alan Brown and his Cooper, Tony Ullman in a Veritas, Eric Brandon in a Cooper, Harry Schell, the only American driver making regular appearances, is in an old Maserati. And, sorry, I ran out of room. On the last row, Peter Hurt in a privateer Ferrari, and not even setting qualifying times, Louis Rosier in his privateer Ferrari, Max de Terra in an old Gordini, and Maurice Trintignant, who, for whatever reason, actually showed up in a privateer Ferrari instead of driving for Gordini. I think that perhaps Gordini only had 2 factory cars ready for this first race and chose to give them to Manzone and Beira. Now, on the actual day of the race, having set no time in qualifying, Trintignant found himself unable to fix his engine and didn't even start the race. So, there's that for him. It was a warm and sunny, nice day in Switzerland, however, unlike the previous year. And at the start, Farina and Taruffi got away just fine into the lead. Beira made a lightning start from 7th into 3rd, with Moss also making gains, along with Abacassis in the HWMs. Manzone and Fischer both started quite badly. Within a lap, De Terra, in his ancient Gordini, was out with a magneto failure, but Sterling Moss was driving brilliantly, fighting his way past Manzone and Simon into 3rd, only to have to pit for spark plugs due to a misfire. Meanwhile, at the back of the field, Louis Rosier crashed out, although luckily he was only bruised, despite the dangers of this time. Within a few more laps, the retirements inevitable to the 1950s began to pile up as Tony Ullmann was out with a fuel leak and Hans Stuck with an engine failure, taking out both of the German entries. Meanwhile, despite the absence of Moss, Moss at the back anyway, his teammate at HWM, Abacassis, was making his way up past Fischer and Manzone and towards the front of the race as we crawled past 10 laps. Meanwhile, Farina and Taruffi were in total control of the race at the front. And then, as though Moss's problem hadn't been enough bad luck for HWM, Abacassis and Collins proceeded to have virtually simultaneous half-shaft failures, fortunately emerging unscathed, but obviously taking both of them very much out of the race, and basically ending HWM's chances at anything. Now, on lap 17, there was an upset as Farina retired from the lead with magneto failure, costing him a near certain race win, with Taruffi not really threatening him. A lap later, Simon was called in from 3rd, and immediately he was effectively the replacement driver for Ascari for this race for Ferrari, by the way. Simon was called in from 3rd and gave his car to Farina. His lead over Manzone was so enormous that no places were actually lost. In fact, Manzone was slipping behind Fischer by this point. Only Beira was actually able to somewhat keep up with the Ferraris, although still not as fast as the front two. And just a couple of laps later, in any case, he had to pit for repairs to his exhaust and would drop to 4th, leaving Ferrari in a 1-2-3 position with Taruffi, Farina in what had begun as Simon's car, and then Fischer in the privateer Ferrari as well. Having dropped, Manzone, meanwhile, retired with radiator issues, which left Beira the only competitor remotely close to the Ferraris, and him unable to quite keep up with their pace. A few laps later on lap 25, as it became obvious what had happened, and remember, there weren't really, HWM had to actually get the cars back and examine them in order to figure out what had happened, or at least talk to their drivers, and that would have taken a lot longer than it would today. But by lap 25, it became clear to the team that what had happened with the simultaneous half-shaft failures, and they proceeded to withdraw Moss and Macklin out of concerns that the same thing could happen to them, which means all 4 HWMs that started the race are now out. Now, the race carried on fairly uneventfully, with Ferrari in total control at the front, followed by the Gordinis, and of course, this being 1952, cars continued to drop like flies, with Shell retiring with an engine failure. Farina was the fastest man on track by this point, but Taruffi had a big lead of several minutes thanks to Farina having to take over the car that Simon had started, which Simon had fallen behind, and then it cost more time to make the switch, and so on. However, Ferrari were in an imperious 1-2-3 position, until, of course, Farina retired again with his second magneto failure of the day, taking him out for good this time. That, of course, left Taruffi in a totally commanding position with only the Swiss privateer Fischer following him, Gordini's chance at double points ended when Prince Bira of Thailand retired with his own engine failure, which managed by this point to bring the Fraser, Nash, and Cooper into the points. Alan Brown, and Eric Brandon were fighting hard for the last points until Brandon had to pit for repairs on lap 55. In the end, Taruffi would lead home a pretty crushing Ferrari 1-2 with the fastest lap over the local privateer Rudy Fischer. John Beira podiumed for Gordini in his Grand Prix racing debut, ending any questions about whether or not he would be any good in single-seaters. So, the victory to Taruffi over Fischer. Beira was a full lap behind the Ferraris. Taking the last points, Ken Wharton and his Fraser Nash 2 laps down, and Alan Brown and his Cooper 3 laps down. After them, the only other 3 finishers were DeGraff and Reed, who was 4 laps behind, Hurt, who was 6, and Brandon, who was 7, with, as you can see, literally the vast majority of the field having retired during the race. That, of course, now the championship standing system at this time was 8-6-4-3-2 for the top 5 drivers, plus 1 bonus point for fastest lap. Taruffi did have fastest lap, and so he became, well, maximum points and the first championship leader with 9. To Fischer with 6, Beira 4, Wharton 3, Brown 2. Farina would be expected to be a championship protagonist, having won the title just 2 years prior and being in the clear fastest car. And assuming he is, this is a bit of a disaster for him, having retired on a day when Ascari was absent and unable to fight him. Now, there was no official Constructors' Championship yet in 1952, but I'll keep track of an unofficial one using basically the rules of the first actual Constructor Championship, which is that only the top finishing car for any constructor finishes, and dropping points the same way as the drivers. And under that rule set, of course, Ferrari has 9 points, Gordini 4, Fraser Nash 3, and Cooper 2. There'll be a couple more small races before the, well, actually before the Indianapolis 500, technically, but the F2 Eiffelrennen, which was, well, not the German Grand Prix, but held on the same track as it. It was mostly local German entries. However, Fischer did show up in his privateer Ferrari, as did Sterling Moss in his HWM, Wharton in his Fraser Nash, and Duncan Hamilton in his HWM, and funnily enough, they pretty much routed the local German entries on their own track, with Fischer in the privateer Ferrari winning by a comfortable 40 seconds over Moss, then Wharton, Hamilton, and Tony Ullman in the Veritas being the top German finisher. In fact, all of the other German finishers retired, so they were the only 5 out of 16 starters to actually finish the race. A bit brutal on the assorted BMW-powered Germans that made the entry. Also in the interim, the Grand Prix de Paris, actually, I mean, it was a bit outside of Paris, but quite close to Paris, at the Circuit Linos Montlhéry, however one is supposed to pronounce that. In any case, it's only about 20 miles outside of Paris, 30 kilometers, so not too far. Now, Manzone did take pole, but Taruffi, Villarizi, and Farina had all showed up to drive for Ferrari. Beira had arrived for Gordini as well, so, well, Gordini was going maximum effort, considering this is one of their home races. It did not pay off, as Taruffi won ahead of a car that Farina and Simon had again ended up sharing, although this time they actually made it to the finish line. And then Rosier in a privateer Ferrari, both Manzone and Beira retired for Gordini, as did Villarizi. Now you'll see he's already starting non-championship races again, but for whatever reason, supposedly his lingering injuries from that road car crash, Ferrari would not choose to start him in the World Championship for quite a long time to come. Now, the Indianapolis 500. This is technically a race of the Formula One World Championship, although it is run to entirely different American AAA regulations otherwise. Alberto Ascari does show up to conduct the race in a Ferrari-built car. He's only able to qualify 25th, but he does qualify and starts the race. Now, Chet Miller is the pole holder ahead of Bill Vukovic, Fred Agabashian, Andy Linden, and Jack McGrath, a total of 33 starters. It's, of course, just an oval. In the end, the winner would be Troy Ruttman of Kuzma, ahead of Jim Rathman, Sam Hanks, Dwayne Carter, and Art Cross, all driving various Offenhauser-powered vehicles. Kuzma, Curtis Kraft, and Slavsky. Bill Vukovic took the fastest lap point, but had to retire. Unfortunately, Ascari's attempt to enter the Indianapolis 500 would be ill-fated, as he made it only 40 laps before a wheel collapsed and he was forced to retire. He was placed 31st overall. So after 2 races of the World, it was a sort of, I don't know if we would call it a gamble exactly, because I don't think it was made out of any sort of, I don't want to imply that it was made out of any sort of cowardice or unwillingness to face his opponents in Europe. I think Ascari wanted, it was, if anything, more ambitious, an effort to try to win the Indianapolis 500, unheard of for a European driver. But it did not work out for Ascari, and he finds himself, after 2 races out of just 8 in this World Championship, with 0 points. On the other hand, effectively, all of his real opponents have at most 1 race win's worth of points, so it's not at all irrecoverable, with only 4 results even counting for the season. Now, this was the peak of the racing season in general, and before Belgium, there were several more minor races. At the Grand Prix de l'Aubageois, or Albi, Fangio actually showed up for about the only single-seater race of the season, along with Gonzalez, as BRM managed to make an entry with its old F1 cars, alongside Rosier, Trintignant, Gerald Cabantus, and Ferrari, and a pair of Talbots. In the end, Fangio and Gonzalez would both retire, as the BRMs proved as unreliable as ever, as did Trintignant, as did Beira in his Gordini. In the end, Louis Rosier, ahead of Chico Landi, would win 1-2 in their privateer Ferraris. Then Gerald Cabantus in a Talbot, Alberto Crespo in another Talbot, and Peter Whitehead in his old Ferrari. Then an F2 race, which was a big early mid-season event, the Gran Premio del Autodroma di Monza. Ferrari, of course, made maximum effort with factory team and privateers. No less than 12 Ferraris and 6 Maseratis started the race at Monza, headed by Alberto Ascari and Farina, Gonzalez in his Maserati, Villarizi, Soyman. Fangio, you'll note, was here and started 29th. The reason for this is pretty simple. Fangio had missed his connecting flight and proceeded to drive through the night from Lyon over the Alps, finally arriving half an hour before this race, having not slept at all, having not qualified, but he climbed into his Maserati, he started, and on the second lap, he crashed his car and was thrown out of the cockpit, barely surviving, breaking his neck. He was rushed to hospital. It's been months recuperating. Fortunately for the racing world, he did recover fully in the end, despite his severe injuries, but kids, let that be a lesson to you. Even the world champion is not immortal or perfect. That being said, I should mention that the Indy 500 winner Troy Ruttman, at 22 years and 80 days old, he would be the youngest World Drivers' Championship race winner, officially, until Fernando Alonso in 2003. Forgot to throw that in on the Indy 500 page, but that's a statistic. So, with Fangio out immediately and out for the season, frankly, Farina would be the winner ahead of Simon and Fisher, then Peter Walker in another Ferrari, that's Ferrari 1, 2, 3, 4, and Eric Brandon in a Cooper. Ascari and Villarizi all retired, so did Gonzalez in his Maserati. The race was run as 2 heats, with the standing decided by aggregate time, interestingly. A few races were done like that, all non-championship ones in this time period. Unfortunately, we come now to the death of Luigi Fagioli, a renowned pre-war racer. He had taken 5 podiums and finished third overall in the championship in 1950 with Alfa Romeo, despite being over 50 years old. He had to give his car to Fangio in France in 1951 and then retired from Grand Prix racing. And he did not actually die while racing a Formula One car, but he was killed in practice for the Monaco Grand Prix, which you will notice was still not on the schedule in 1951. It was a sports car race, and although it seemed to be a minor crash, he eventually died several weeks later due to internal injuries at the age of 54. His part in the World Driver Championship is fairly limited, as he was already over 50 years old by the time it was created, but he was a true legend of motorsport. Unfortunately, he was only one of many to die in the early years of the sport. On a happier note, we now move on to the Belgian Grand Prix. On June 22nd at Spa-Francorchamps. One of the most legendary tracks in F1 history, of course, and one of the most stupidly dangerous, especially at this time. 14.12 kilometers, built on entirely public roads linking the Belgian villages of Francorchamps, Malmedy, and Stavelot. Almost no changes have been made from the original public roads. Those that had been made were mainly to increase speed. In all probability, Spa was the fastest and most dangerous track in Europe. Almost the entire track was basically a straight, with the exception of perhaps like Les Combes and La Source, but Bournonville maybe. But the Master Kink, for instance, wasn't quite flat out, at least not yet, but wasn't really a corner either. It was a kink. Now, Maserati still weren't ready, but Ferrari, Gordini, and HWM brought their factory teams, ready for sort of the proper campaign to begin. You'll notice it had been a full month since Switzerland, with the Indy 500 and a lot of non-championship races in between. This was perhaps, especially with Ascari returning, the start of the World Championship season in a lot of ways. Even though, obviously, a lot of points were on the books already, but perhaps it could be compared to modern-day Spanish Grand Prix, with all the teams finally ready and returning and so on. I don't know. Anyway, some 22 entrants arrived, 5 Ferraris, 5 Gordinis, 5 HWMs, 3 Coopers, and 1 each of Fraser Nash, ERA, Aston Butterworth, and Veritas. Qualifying was on June 21st. Ascari, having returned from the USA with no results, needed them here, and he got them immediately, taking pole by 3 seconds, 4 minutes 37 seconds his time, ahead of Farina and then Taruffi. 12 seconds slower than the 1951 pole, but still more than good enough. The Gordinis of Manzon and Beira were on the second row, but were no less than 15 and 19 seconds per lap slower than Ascari in qualifying. Then Hawthorne in his Cooper, Ken Wharton and Paul Frere in their HWMs. You'll remember Frere is the Belgian local and rowing champion. On the fourth row, Alan Brown in his Cooper and Sterling Moss, now driving, after a brief stint with HWM at the start of the season, now driving an obsolete English racing automobiles car with the original 4.5-liter engine cut down to a 2-liter Bristol that a lot of the British independents were using. Well, he was 30.6 seconds slower than Ascari, and we know how good Moss is, so that should tell you something about the car, probably. Peter Collins in his HWM, Eric Brandon in the Cooper, Charles de Tornaco in a privateer Ferrari, Lance Macklin in an HWM, Robin Montgomery Charrington in an Aston Butterworth, Tony Gaze of Australia in an HWM, Louis Rosier in a Ferrari, and Prince Bira in his old Gordini. Then Johnny Clace in what was apparently a new Gordini, but he was very slow in it. And Roger Laurent in an HWM. And at the very back, ran out of space again, would be Arthur Legat in his Veritas, and Robert O'Brien of the USA in his old Gordini. Now, as the cars lined up on the grid, it began pouring rain, a serious downpour, and perhaps as a result, Taruffi immediately stalled as he tried to launch from third and would drop back to ninth. Manzone, right behind him, got caught up in it and dropped 4 places as well. And meanwhile, Beira, who was not affected, made a fantastic start and went into the first corner in third place, went into La Source in third, and then down Rouge and Radion somehow passed Ascari and Farina and would come across the line at the end of the first lap. Would come across the line at the end of the first lap, leading the race against all expectations. Sterling Moss also made a brilliant start from 10th place into 5th, only to immediately retire when his engine seized and he spun off halfway through the lap. But it was a good half a lap, very good half a lap. By the end of the first lap, Beira was the leader from Ascari, Farina. Mike Hawthorne had made his way into 4th after starting 6th. Ken Wharton in the Fraser Nash somehow making his way into 5th and on for a second consecutive points finish in theory. Unfortunately, on the second lap, Beira proceeded to spin at La Source, having led for just about exactly a lap, maybe not quite a full lap. The Ferraris went through, and Ascari and Farina immediately began pulling away. Frankly, Ascari began pulling away, Farina at a much slower rate, but clearly not able to match Ascari. By the end of lap 3, Collins and his HWM was out with another half-shaft failure, and that's at least 3 of those for them. Bit of an issue they've got to work on there. By lap 4, Taruffi, after his dreadful start, was storming steadily back up the field towards the podium places. But Beira promised to give him a much tougher fight than most of his opponents so far. Manzone was also regrouping after his bad start. Rosier went out on lap 6 with a transmission failure. Taruffi was by now right behind Beira, trying to pass, but with no luck so far against the fiery Frenchman and his Gordini, despite his considerable power advantage on this very fast circuit. On lap 11, Ken Wharton managed to spin through a barbed wire fence at Stavelot, but fortunately, although a bit scraped, bruised, and perhaps even cut, was also not severely hurt, so a lucky day for him. Bad things have happened with fences, especially barbed wire ones. Taruffi, meanwhile, continued to struggle to pass Beira. He finally got it done on lap 14 at Bernonville, only to then spin at Malmedy, having probably taken too much speed through Bernonville, you would guess. Beira, still right behind him, was collected in the spin. Both of them went into a ditch and couldn't get started again, although fortunately unhurt, which left Mike Hawthorne running 3rd. The retirements unsurprisingly kept coming, with Montgomery Sharrington and his Aston Butterworth out. On lap 18, the Ferraris cruising in their 1-2 at the front, with Ascari very comfortably ahead of Farina. On lap 25, Hawthorne and his dream of a second race podium were unfortunately dashed due to a fuel leak, which forced him to pit, bringing Manzone onto the podium. And frankly, perhaps not the most exciting of races, but except for the first lap, but that's really all she wrote. Ascari proceeded to win the race by 1 minute and 55.2 seconds over Farina, who was himself more than 2 minutes ahead of Manzone, With a 4:54 flat, Ascari claims the fastest lap, and of course it was a very comfortable Ferrari 1-2. Manzone took the podium for Gordini this time, with Beira out. Mike Hawthorne did claim 4th for Cooper, and Paul Frere was 5th at his home race. And here we have a shot of, I do believe it's Ascari, it's Ascari. A shot of Ascari taking the checkered flag. So, a very comfortable win for Ascari over Farina, Manzone. Mike Hawthorne claimed 4th, a lap down, and this is a big lap in the Cooper, and Paul Frere 2 laps down in the HWM, nonetheless scored points at his home race. Other finishers, Alan Brown also 2 laps down, De Tornaco, Claes, and Brandon 3 down, Bira, Macklin, and Laurent 4 down, Legat 5, O'Brien and Gaze finished 6 laps down. Although a much better overall finishing race than in Switzerland, finishing rate than in Switzerland, despite the rain. So, after 3 races, sort of, but 2, whatever, Ascari and Taruffi of Ferrari found themselves tied for the World Championship lead with 9 points apiece. Troy Ruttman, Indy 500 winner, of course technically 3rd at this point. Farina did take 6 points here, so he was really very much in the race. Also Fischer and Jim Rathman. Manzone and Beira, 4 points each for Gordini, plus Sam Hanks. And Hawthorne, Wharton, Brown, Frere, also point scorers. Now, constructors-wise, of course, Ferrari had won 2 races. Gordini had been 3rd in 2 races, which, yeah. Also picking up some good points. Fraser Nash and HWM a couple as well. So the British independents, very much not as fast as Ferrari and Gordini, perhaps, but definitely there to pick up the scraps, which is more than could be said for British entries in the last couple of years. Now, ahead of the French Grand Prix, there would be a couple more minor races. The Grand Prix de Le Marne was, of course, held in France, and the Ferraris showed up in force with Ascari and Farina at the front, then Manzone, Beira, and Villarizi. Now, this was the track that hosted the World Championship race the past 2 years, but it had been rotated to Rouen this year. However, it is very interesting to note that although Ascari had spark plug problems and ultimately gave his car to Villarizi out of frustration, which would finish 3rd, John Beira beat Farina on pure pace around this track, which is almost entirely straights, and would win the Grand Prix de Le Marne ahead of Farina, then Ascari, Villarizi, Beira, and Rosier, with Manzone out as well as Villarizi's original car. Now this, I believe, is pretty much the first time all season that the Ferrari Tipo 500 had been beaten on pace, perhaps signaling that the Gordinis have finally taken a bit of a step up. At a very good time as well, with their home race occurring in just a week. And that, of course, would be the French Grand Prix at Rouen-les-Essarts on July 6th. A fairly, well, almost brand new modern track, opened in 1950, very good pit facilities and the like. It was a street circuit, though, with a cobbled section and a steep wooded hillside around Nouveau Monde. And then below that, a lot more conventional straights, but quite an interesting hairpin woods cobblestone section up there, apparently. Gordini hopes were, of course, very high for their home event after their success at the Grand Prix de Le Marne. No less than 7 Ferraris and 5 Gordinis showed up, which would comprise literally the majority of the grid between the two of them, along with 3 HWMs, 3 Maseratis, and a single Cooper and Alta. Gordini hopes took a bit of a hit immediately as Ascari took pole on the 5th of July, 2:14.8 ahead of Farina and Taruffi. The Gordinis were sitting on the second row, though, with Beira 4.5 seconds behind, Manzone 5.6. maybe not as bad as at previous races, but still distinctly slower than the Ferraris in qualifying. Then Trintignant in his older Gordini, Collins in his HWM, and Bira in his Gordini. Which, it was actually a newer Gordini this time. I don't entirely know why he was alternating, but he did seem to be. Rosier in his Privateer Ferrari, Gerard Cabantus in his HWM, then De Graffenried and Schell both driving Privateer Maseratis, and Peter Whitehead driving an Alta rather than the Privateer Ferrari he had used the last couple of years. Lance Macklin in an HWM, and Hawthorne in his Cooper, quite a bad qualifying here after a very good race in Belgium. Then Felipe Tonsanin in an old Maserati. Fischer qualifying very badly in his Privateer Ferrari here. Franco Camati in yet another Privateer Ferrari. Piero Carini on the last row in his Privateer Ferrari, along with Johnny Claes in his old Gordini. Only 25 seconds between first and last, though, so that's relatively tight for the standards of the time. It was once again a rainy race, although maybe not as bad as at the start in Belgium. Nonetheless, Taruffi once again started badly. Fischer, meanwhile, was unable to start at all with engine issues, but he was at the back anyway. Probably his engine issues were part of why he'd qualified so badly. But anyway, Taruffi once again made a bad start and would drop behind the Gordinis right at the start. Unfortunately, Beira, sitting in third, well, he did his best to overtake the Ferraris. Not only was his best not quite good enough, but he pushed a little too hard and proceeded to spin into a ditch, although he would manage to get himself out again in order to make repairs. Meanwhile, Prince Bira had a misfire and had to pit as well. Carini was out with an engine failure. And that was a big blow to the Gordinis, to say the least. By lap 4, Taruffi was already back to third, and the Ferraris were beginning to build a gap with Manzone, unable to keep up with them. Beira briefly had, but then it spun into a ditch, so truth be told, the Gordini still didn't quite have the pace. By lap 8, Schell was out with a gearbox issue, but he did take over De Graffenried's car. I'm not quite sure what arrangement they had, but apparently they had one. I believe they were both driving officially for De Graffenried's Swiss team, so why Schell got the car when he retired, I'm not quite sure. In any case, by lap 16, Claes was out with an engine failure. Rosier and Whitehead both followed with engine and clutch issues. Meanwhile, Hawthorne, you may have noticed, has made his way up quite a lot already, and by a third of the way through the race, manages to pass Lance Macklin and is attacking Peter Collins for 6th. Huge recovery from his, 15th place qualifying. Starting to look like, Hawthorne and Collins are the two top young British talents coming into the year, in theory, along with maybe Moss, but Moss doesn't quite have a decent car to drive, so Hawthorne and Collins is probably the battle of the British juniors at the moment. By lap 35, Schell had retired for the second time of the race with brake failure, and Collins and Hawthorne were still fighting their epic battle for 6th, which had now gone on for over 10 laps, and frankly was providing most of the entertainment, with the Ferraris absolutely cruising 1-2-3, Manzone and Trintignant unable to keep up with them. It took until lap 42, but Hawthorne finally did get past the wall that was Peter Collins, and proceeded to immediately attack the Gordinis and pass Trintignant within another couple of laps, only for the great drive to come to a brutal end with an engine misfire and ultimately ignition failure, which proceeded to take him out of the race entirely. Meanwhile, Beira had been recovering from his early spin, as had Bira from his misfire issue, but they now found themselves in the same position that Hawthorne had been for 20 or 30 laps, stuck behind Peter Collins. Meanwhile, Fischer I think maybe I put this the wrong way around, actually, yeah. But Peter Fischer's car had been taken over by his friend, sorry, good grief. Rudy Fischer's car had been taken over by his friend Peter Hurt, although actually I think maybe it was the other way around, that Fischer had not. I think Fischer had not started, so I think Hurt took over Fischer's car at this point. In any case, the two Swiss drivers were basically sharing their single remaining privateer Ferrari at this point, and they did trade at least once during the race. Prince Bira proceeded to go out on lap 57 with an axle failure, which ended his pretty good recovery. Beira was still hounding Collins in an effort to, well, not quite get into the points, but there's a chance of retirement at any time, of course. It didn't happen, though. After 77 laps, Ascari won the first Grand Slam, or Grand Chelem, of his career. Ferrari 1, 2, 3, with Ascari, Farina, and Taruffi. Manzon and Trintignant taking the last couple of points for Gordini. Peter Collins did hold on to 6th ahead of Beira, but of course that doesn't quite pay points, but still a good run for him. Ascari finished a full lap ahead of Nino Farina, having led the race from start to finish from pole with the fastest lap. A grand slam indeed. Piero Taruffi was 2 laps behind in his Ferrari. Manzon 3 laps off in his Gordini. And Trintignant in his older Gordini was 5 laps behind by the end of the race. Peter Collins, along with Beira, Etonsanin, and Macklin, were 7 laps down. Geraud Cabantus, 9 laps. The Fischer and Hurt car, 11. And Camotti, 14. I think what happened with Fischer is that his original car broke down, but he started in the car that was supposed to be Hurt's and then eventually gave it to Hurt later in the race. I think that is what happened, yeah. So with 2 wins on the trot, Ascari became the clear championship leader with 18 ahead of Taruffi with 13 and Farina with 12. The 3 Ferrari drivers now entirely at the top of the championship. After a 3rd and a 4th, Manzon, their closest competition, with 7, Fischer 6, Beira and Hanks on 4, Hawthorne and Wharton with 3, and a few other scattered points about. Of course, Ferrari retained its perfect record, accepting the Indy 500 with 27 points so far. Gordini, the clear 2nd place thus far. Cooper, Fraser Nash, HWM all picking up a scattering of points, but not the match for the top 2. Ahead of once again, we have a couple of minor races with the Grand Prix des Sables d'Olonne. The Ferraris did show up to that the next weekend. It appears to be essentially a triangle, and it was held in where is this place? Sables, which is on the Atlantic Ocean on the western coast of France, halfway between La Rochelle and Saint-Nazaire. Not a large town, really. Anyway, unfortunately, the real reason this race is even relevant, Jean Beira broke his shoulder during qualifying for this race, which would put him out for a time anyway. I mean, probably not as long as it should have, but at the very least would take him out of the British Grand Prix that was upcoming. The Ferraris, Ascari and Farina both broke down, but Villarizi nonetheless got the result for Ferrari, ahead of Peter Collins in the HWM, and then Johnny Claes in a Maserati. Bira and Manzon shared a Gordini, which only managed to take 4th. Not a great day out for either Ferrari or Gordini, really. And that brings us on to the British Grand Prix, which was at Silverstone on July 19th. Now, the Silverstone circuit was a surplus RAF airfield, a fast track with 5 real corners, After being owned by the Royal Automobile Club in the immediate post-war period, in 1952 it had been bought by the British Racing Drivers Club, which still maintains its headquarters there, and the pit lane had been moved from the Abbey Woodcote Straight to the Woodcote Copse Straight, where the national pit lane still remains. In 1951, it had been won by Gonzalez for Ferrari, the first non-Alfa Romeo win in F1's history. With Beira out due to a broken shoulder, the Gordini entry was weakened. Meanwhile, all of the small British manufacturers made huge entries for their home race. No less than 32 cars appeared at Silverstone, 7 Ferraris, 4 Gordinis, 5 Coopers, 4 HWMs, 4 Connaughts, 4 Maseratis, a Fraser Nash, an Alta, an ERA, and an Aston Butterworth. Pole position went surprisingly to Farina after he and Ascari set an identical time of 1 minute and 50 seconds, 6.6 seconds slower than the previous year's time. But Farina set the time earlier and so received pole. Taruffi was 3 seconds behind the pair of them, and Manzone took 4th in the lead Gordini entry. The second row, Ken Downing and his Connaught, Reg Parnell in a Cooper, and Mike Hawthorne also in a Cooper. Then Dennis Poor in another Connaught, Eric Thompson in the third Connaught, Prince Bira in his Gordini, and Duncan Hamilton in an HWM. Behind them, Graham Whitehead in his Alta, Alan Brown in the Cooper, Peter Collins in his HWM, then Fisher in his privateer Ferrari, Sterling Moss in the severely outdated ERA, still putting in surprisingly good results, Kenneth McAlpine in a Connaught, and Eric Brandon in his Cooper, Roy Salvadori and Peter Whitehead in their older privateer Ferraris, and Maurice Trintignant in a third Gordini, quite a ways behind Manzone. David Murray in a Cooper, Clace in an older Gordini, Peter Hurt in his privateer Ferrari, and Tony Crook in the Fraser Nash. Tony Gaze in an HWM, Idle Cantoni and Gino Bianco in a Maserati, both in old privateer Maseratis. And then on the very last row, Lance Macklin in an HWM, Bill Aston in his own Aston Butterworth, and Tullio de Graffenried and Harry Schell in their Maseratis, older Maseratis, and neither of them actually set a qualifying time. That being said, yes, here we have a nice image of the starting grid from the 1952 Grand Prix. Quite a lot different from what we would expect from modern Formula One. And yet it's still recognizably Silverstone, I would say, if anyone's ever been to that straight. So, as we reach the start of the race, Bill Aston was unable to even start due to some sort of failure with his car. Right off the bat, Ascari would immediately take the lead into the first corner, while Taruffi once again had a horrible start and dropped 6 places, his third bad start in a row. Dennis Poor made a great start in his Connaught, and almost immediately also, Idle Cantoni and his Maserati were out with brake failure. Within a few laps, Taruffi was fighting his way back up the field. Ascari and Farina, well, Ascari was pulling away from everyone, while Farina was having trouble shaking the Connaughts of Poor and Downing. They hadn't really entered yet in this season, but were proving very competitive on their home turf in Britain. And also Peter Hurt and his privateer Ferrari, last out of the 7 Ferraris, was out with brake failure. As the race carried on, Taruffi continued to fight his way up through the field, while Manzone, the main real hope for Gordini, went out with a clutch failure. Bira wasn't too much further behind, though. Taruffi was up to 4th by this point, having managed to pass Thompson, Downing, and Parnell, but was really struggling to pass Poor and make his way onto the podium for that Ferrari 1-2-3. Unfortunately for the British teams, Poor spun on oil on the 15th lap, and Taruffi was able to take 3rd. By then, Ascari was already 20 seconds clear of Farina, who had at least managed to hold off the Connaughts. Further back, David Murray and his Cooper were out with an engine failure. Another 5 laps, and Farina found himself forced to pit with a misfire. The stop then immediately failed to fix that problem, which dropped him not as far back as you would think, as the Ferrari still probably had a power advantage, but that arrow was in the wrong place. But Farina dropped back at least as far as 7th. Hawthorne, meanwhile, was making gains quite rapidly, making his way past all the Connaughts and his rival Cooper Parnell. And Tony Gazin, 1HWM, was out with an engine failure. Trintignant was the next to go out with a gearbox issue. Now, although the Connaughts were running extremely well, unfortunately, while most cars, you'll notice in 1952, hadn't really had to make fuel stops due to the much smaller engines compared to previous years, the Connaughts did not have the fuel efficiency that the Ferraris did. As a result, just short of halfway through the race, they had to make a fuel stop, which cost them heavily. Well, actually, Thompson lost surprisingly little time, but Poor lost a fair bit of time, and Downing had a pretty bad pit stop and also lost a lot of time, which certainly helped out Farina, now struggling, and of course put Mike Hawthorne into 3rd at his home race. Meanwhile, Sterling Moss had not done especially well off of the start, and after running in the midfield, retired with an increasingly severe misfire on his outdated ERA. 10 laps after their pit stop, the Connaughts were quickly recovering, but were unable to catch up to Hawthorne, although they were able to retake not just Parnell, but also made their way past Farina, who was continuing to struggle with his own misfire. By this point, halfway through the race, Ascari already led by a full lap. That's another error. That should be Taruffi in second, but Taruffi didn't have a chance against Ascari, frankly. Farina, with his misfire, didn't have a chance either, and it was total dominance for Ascari. The Connaughts and Hawthorne and Farina battling for 3rd was the main entertainment of the race at this point. Meanwhile, Duncan Hamilton and his HWM out with an engine failure. Now, the remainder of the race was surprisingly uneventful. Peter Collins eventually went out with an ignition failure, but from there on out, the Connaughts dogged Hawthorne's heels more or less for the rest of the race, or at least Poor was able to, but they never quite found their way past him, nor was Farina with his misfire able to catch Poor and Thompson, although he was able to stay ahead of Parnell. So for the second half of the race, surprisingly little changed in the standings, and finally Ascari took the win with the fastest lap after 85 laps, having lapped the field. Mike Hawthorne took his maiden podium in his 3rd race in Formula, 2, I suppose. Connaught had a great result at home with 4th and 5th. Maybe not quite as good as Cooper, to be fair, but certainly an outstanding result for them, having not showed up at the previous races of the season. Of course, Ferrari still had a 1-2. That's Ascari and Taruffi. Terribly sorry about that error. So, Ascari won by a lap from Taruffi, 2 laps over Hawthorne and Poor. Eric Thompson finished 3 laps behind in his Connaught. But in the points. 3 laps behind and in the points. That hasn't happened all that much in F1. Farina, Parnell, Salvadori, and Downing were also 3 laps down, as were Peter Whitehead and Bira. They were 4 laps down. Graham Whitehead and Fisher 5, Claes Macklin and McAlpine 6. Shell was 7, Bianco 8, DeGraff and Reed and Brandon 9, Crook 10. Alan Brown, classified 22nd and last, was 16 laps down, and the classification rules were applied a bit inconsistently at this time, but technically he should still be behind Peter Collins, who had retired, really, considering he finished less laps. Now that was a 3rd victory in a row for Alberto Ascari, of course, and that left him leading the World Championship by 8 points, a full race win in this era, over Piero Taruffi with 19. Farina with 12, having missed the points again, was, well, 3 races left, up to 27 points theoretically, although he would have had to drop points, but suffice to say Farina's championship chances were starting to look like they were gone already, on account of a couple of mechanical failures and just not being faster than Ascari at the 2 races that he hadn't had mechanical failures. Other than Troy Ruttman, the Indy 500 winner, Hawthorne and Manzone were now tied for best of the rest with a 3rd and a 4th apiece. Fischer still just had that outstanding 2nd in his native Switzerland, but no great success since. Beira had a podium. Also, Ken Wharton, Dennis Poor, Alan Brown, Trintignant, Frere, Thompson. And a shout out to Bill Vukovic for getting a single point thus far, based on a fastest lap before retiring. As far as our unofficial Constructors' Championship goes, Ferrari, of course, with a perfect record in races that aren't the Indy 500. Gordini remains the 2nd overall, but with that podium from Hawthorne, Cooper isn't too far behind them anymore in terms of success for the season. Albeit, I think I'd have to do the math, but I think unofficially Ferrari may have already clinched this championship. In any case, it's not going to be much of a problem for them unless Gordini start winning races immediately. Technically, there's up to 27 points available, takes them to 38, but they have to drop 3, so yeah. Ferrari would in fact have already mathematically clinched this championship if it had existed. Of course, it doesn't, so bit of a moot point, really. Ahead of the German Grand Prix, which would be race number 6 of the year, there were a couple of non-championship races. The Daily Mail Trophy was held at the Boreham Racing Circuit in West Essex, England. The Ferraris made an appearance, as did the BRMs of Gonzalez and Wharton, mostly Gonzalez, and a host of other cars, especially Coopers. None of them really were able to compete, though. Villarizi took the win ahead of Landi in a privateer Ferrari. Hawthorne and his Cooper took another podium, albeit non-championship. And behind them, Philippe Etanceline in his Talbot and Louis Rosier in his privateer older Ferrari. Gonzalez retired as BRM still couldn't put a decent car together. From there, we proceed on to the German Grand Prix on August 3rd. Now, the Nürburgring, of course, had been finished in 1927 as Germany's premier purpose-built racetrack, and you all probably know it was winding, mountainous, often rainy, very long, nicknamed the Green Hell. Won the previous year by Ascari for Ferrari. Now, a lot of the regulars of the field were actually at the Daily Mail Trophy, which was held just the day before, or at least the British regulars were. However, the numbers of the grid were more than made up for by a massive array of local German entries. And Maserati finally made an appearance entering its new A6 GCM for Bonneto, as Gonzalez was racing at the Daily Mail Trophy for BRM, and Maserati only had 1 car ready anyway. Nor, as we shall see, was that car quite actually ready yet. But in any case, no less than 34 cars arrived, 7 Ferraris, 3 Gordinis, 4 HWMs, 3 Maseratis, an Aston Butterworth, and from the locals, no less than 7 Veritas, 4 AFM, and 1 each of Reif, Heck, Naka, Krakow, and Balsa BMW-powered home-built or garage-built designs. None of these, as we shall see, were quite... Well, the Veritas was the closest, but none of them were really up to the power of the World Championship regulars, but they were all locals very familiar with the Nürburgring and eager to give a challenge to the traveling circuit. Nonetheless, Ascari took pole very comfortably by 2.9 seconds from Farina and by 14.7 seconds from Maurice Trintignant in the Gordini. Of course, such a massive gap is a lot easier on a track with a lap over 10 minutes this year, thanks to the smaller engine displacements, 10:04.4. In fact, Farina being only 2.9 seconds behind. Well, horrifying by modern standards, but pretty good on a track of this length by 1950 standards. Anyway, Manzone completed the front row in his Gordini. Then Taruffi and his Ferrari, ending up behind the two Gordinis. Not a good sign for him. Fischer in his privateer Ferrari, and Paul Peach, the first of the locals, in a Veritas. Now, unfortunately, we only have the qualifying times of the best 7. I'm, well, not quite sure why only those survived, but I wasn't able to find the others anywhere, so apparently they weren't recorded at the time for whatever reason. But following the top 7 were Hans Klenk in a Veritas, Willy Heeks in an AFM, Bonetto in the still rather experimental new Maserati, well off the pace apparently, Beira in his Gordini, returning from his broken shoulder, maybe not at full strength yet, considering how far behind Trintignant and Manzone he was. Then Fritz Ries in his Veritas, Paul Frere in an HWM, Tony Gaze also in an HWM, Tony Ullman in another Veritas, Bianco in his Maserati, Roger Laurent of Belgium in a privateer Ferrari, Theo Helfrich in a Veritas, Adolf Brudes and Joseph Peters, both in Veritas cars, Aston in his Aston Butterworth, Helmut Niedermeyer and Rudolf Krauss in AFM and Reif BMWs, Rudolf Schuller in a privateer Ferrari, Marcel Balsa in his own Balsa BMW, which was actually French but used a BMW engine and was thus at least half German, I suppose. Eitel Cantoni in his privateer Maserati, Piero Carini in a privateer Ferrari, Willy Krakow in an AFM, and then Ernst Klodwig in his Heck BMW, Gunter Beckham in his Naka BMW, Ludwig Fischer in an AFM, Claes in his HWM. Peter Collins managed to qualify 33rd in his HWM, despite being considered a pretty promising talent, and Harry Merkel last in his Krakow BMW. Nearly all the German cars, including the Veritas cars and the AFMs, were powered by BMW engines. Apparently, it was the only serious F2 grade racing engine available in Germany. It must have been, because none of the others are powered. None of their German cars are powered by anything else. Now, there were supposed to be 34, but no less than 4 cars, Collins, Krakow, Fischer, and Merkel, were unable to take the start due to various mechanical issues. That probably does explain Collins' poor qualifying. With 27 points already on the board, Ascari, with the win and fastest lap, could secure the maximum possible points for the year. Remember that only the best 4 out of 8 scores count. The maximum possible points for the year and an unbeatable score, and thus the World Championship 2 races early in an 8-race season where he didn't score in the first 2 races. Yeah, quite an achievement, if he can do it. And he had pole position, of course, so he had the best shot at it. He got away in the lead as well. Trintignant, meanwhile, started badly from 3rd, while Bonetto in the new Maserati shot from 10th up to 5th. Granted, that's only possibly as little as 1 grid row, maybe 2, but with the 4 and 3 car wide grid, yeah, I believe it's 1 actually. With the 4 and 3 car wide alternating grid, that's not as many rows as you would think in the modern era. But anyway, he did get a good start in the new Maserati, only to immediately pick up a puncture and spin into a ditch. He actually got out again, but was then disqualified for getting Marshall's help to push him out of the ditch, which of course is considered outside assistance. Meanwhile, at the back, well, closer to the back, Bianco and his privateer Maserati were out with an engine failure. With Bonetto out, the Maserati challenge was immediately dead, and only the Gordinis of Manzone and Trintignant were in it to fight the 4, basically, leading Ferraris. Fischer looking like a good race again here. The Nürburgring very rapidly wreaked absolute havoc on the Formula One field. I cannot emphasize enough the state of attrition. Within the first lap, Joseph Peters and Theo Helfrich were both out with engine failures. Paul Frere and Paul Piche with gearbox issues. Piero Carini with a brake problem. And Trintignant ran something over, broke his suspension, and then crashed. Forcing, although he actually limped back to the pits, I believe, but then had to retire. That's 6 cars out within the lap. 5 that weren't able to start at all. And, well, we've trimmed the grid right down very quickly. It didn't really stop either. Bill Aston was the next victim on the second lap. Meanwhile, Taruffi made his way into third past Manzone, and Ferrari found themselves running 1, 2, 3, and 5 just for a bonus. None of the local Germans in the points. Hans Klenk the closest in his Veritas, but not a match for the Ferraris and the Gordinis, which, to be fair, were about the only cars from outside of Germany running well. The attrition kept coming, with Rudolf Schuller out with a suspension issue and Rudolf Krause out with an engine issue on the third lap. Ascari, meanwhile, was setting the fastest lap, cruising comfortably ahead of Farina, as Cantoni was the next out with an axle issue. Then, on the fifth lap, Beckham with an ignition problem. Balsa and Brutus both suffered failures of their BMW engines. And, well, by now we're down to 15 cars running out of the initial 30 in a third of the race distance. Congratulations, Green Hell. Well, it certainly lived up to its name in 1952, apparently. Tony Gaze was next out with a gearbox failure, then Willie Heeks with an engine failure, and then, just to complete the Ferrari success story, the only one who could possibly challenge them, Robert Manzone, lost the wheel and crashed out of the race as a result, leaving the Ferraris running 1, 2, 3, 4, and 6, with John Beira the only non-Ferrari in the points in his Gordini, despite qualifying by far the worst out of the Gordinis, but with so much of the field out or in slower German cars, he had worked his way up now as far as the points. And he stayed there, too. In fact, there seemed to be no drama at all in the race until on lap 17, Ascari made a surprise stop to top up his oil, which he should have been able to do because he was running well ahead of Farina. But his mechanics didn't expect the stop. They panicked. And as a result, he found himself emerging for his final lap 9 seconds behind Farina after the botched pit stop by Ferrari. Meanwhile, Taruffi, running third, picked up suspension damage on the penultimate lap, and thus Fischer and his privateer, plus Beira and his Gordini, found themselves closing pretty fast on the third works Ferrari. Now this, of course, gave Farina a sudden and very unexpected chance to deny Ascari the World Championship if he had been good enough. Because Alberto Ascari was just a little bit too good for Nino Farina. He ran down the 9-second gap and passed Giuseppe Farina halfway through the final lap, crossed the finish line 14 seconds clear of Farina. Some of the wording that I've seen is a little vague, but I believe that he made something on the order of 20 seconds on Farina in a single lap around the Nürburgring. Won the race, had the fastest lap, and won the World Championship, leading home a Ferrari 1, 2, 3, 4 at that. Although, in the course of that final lap, also, Fischer passed Taruffi in order to take the final podium spot thanks to Taruffi's suspension damage. Still a 1, 2, 3, 4 for Ferrari. Ascari wins the World Drivers' Championship of 1952. After Farina, Fischer finishes 7 minutes, 10.1 seconds down. Taruffi and Beira are both a full lap down. A full lap down with a 10-minute lap. So, that. 2 laps down, Lorenz, Rees, and Ullmann. 3 laps, Niedermeyer and Claes. 4 laps, Klenk and Klodvig in the last of the local cars. 12 out of 34 qualifying cars actually finished this race. A just absolutely brutal attrition rate. And of course, with maximum 36 points, Alberto Ascari is the World Drivers' Championship champion already for 1952. The battle at this point, with 2 races to go, is between his teammates Taruffi and Farina. Taruffi actually holds the lead with 22 points thanks to Farina's 2 retirements to 1, and particularly his win in Switzerland where Farina retired. But Farina has been, for the most part, faster than Taruffi, as you can see by beating him in the 2 races where they both finished and didn't have major mechanical problems. Britain is a bit of a rough luck situation for Farina. So that fight is very much on still. Meanwhile, Rudi Fischer now best of the rest with a 2nd and a 3rd for 10 in a privateer Ferrari. So that's Ferrari 1, 2, 3, 4 in the Drivers' Championship. Hawthorne and Manzone still fighting for the best non-Ferrari driver around 7 each. John Beira up to 6. Wharton, Poor, 3, and various others scoring as well. Ferrari already had the maximum points in our unofficial constructors, but now they have more. Gordini continuing to pile up more points with, Gordini managing to take 2 more points by grabbing the last position after the Ferrari 1, 2, 3, 4, in the absence of Cooper, who chose to compete at the Daily Mail Trophy instead. They and all their privateers, yeah. All English, nearly, of course. Also, Fraser, Nash, Connaught, Old Gordini, and HWM have a few points, but nothing major. From there, we go to a last couple of non-championship races. The Grand Prix du Comminges in Comminges was on August 10th. The Ferraris and Gordinis faced off yet again, with Ascari taking pole, but Trintignant and Manzone splitting him from Farina. That didn't really hold in the race, as although Ascari had to take over the car started by Ferrari's 4th driver, Andre Simon, he still won the race, ahead of Farina, who finally made it into 2nd after Trintignant and Manzone retired. John Beira took 3rd, and then Graham Whitehead in an Alta, the only other finisher out of the 19 starters. Worse than the Nürburgring, apparently. The penultimate World Championship race of the 1952 season would be the Dutch Grand Prix at Zandvoort on August 17th. This was the first championship race held at Zandvoort. Built quite a new track, built in 1948 in the dunes of the Dutch North Sea coast. It had been a major non-championship race in the last few years and now made its championship debut. A very wavy and sweeping circuit with the banked Hugenholtzbocht corner and only one real straight on the west side. The last winner had been Louis Rosier in a Talbot, but that was a non-championship race. Interestingly, after those 3 terrible starts in a row and generally underwhelming performances, the old man Ferrari basically cut off that Taruffi-Farina 2nd place battle that I was talking about at the route by pulling Taruffi from his racing lineup and replacing him with the now fully recovered Villarisi for the remainder of the season. After entering 1 car in Germany, Maserati didn't appear here since that car had immediately, suffered a puncture, but I guess they were concerned, perhaps it's questionable whether they were even able to repair it. Even if they were, perhaps they didn't feel it was reliable enough. In any case, Maserati chose to focus all of its factory efforts on the final race of the season in Italy, their home race, and forgo the Dutch Grand Prix. Thus, there would be a total of 18 entrants, 4 Ferraris, 4 Gordinis, 3 HWMs, 3 older Maseratis, a Cooper, a Fraser-Nash, a Connaught, and an ERA. In qualifying, it would be Ascari who took pole by 2.1 seconds over Farina, and then Hawthorne in the Cooper, managing to split them from the just returning Villarizi. Interestingly, they were actually faster than the 1951 pole. I'm not entirely sure if the 51 race might have been in rainy conditions or something, or perhaps it was just the fact of it being a non-championship race, which didn't acquire. Neither the Alfa Romeos nor the factory Ferraris had appeared in 1951, so beating its pole time might just be a reflection of the best cars not having been there. In any case, irrelevant now, really. Villarizi managed to take 4th, although cut off from his teammates by Hawthorne. Then Trintignant in the Gordini. Beira in the other Gordini. Wharton in his Fraser-Nash. And Robert Manzone in the 3rd factory Gordini. Then Lance Macklin and Duncan Hamilton in their HWMs, followed by Frere in his older Gordini, Bianco in his Maserati, and Downing in the Connaught, returning from their one-off appearance in Britain previously. Locals, Dries van der Loof in a HWM and Jan Flinterman in an older Maserati. Then Landy in his Maserati, Charles de Tornaco in his old Ferrari, and Sterling Moss in the ERA once again putting in an appearance, albeit dead last in this case, 18 seconds behind Ascari. As the race started, Ascari held the lead off of the start line, while Hawthorne immediately passed Farina for 2nd. Beira leapt ahead into 4th. Moss made his way well up the order. And Trintignant got a rather bad start. So a bit of chaos at the start with quite a few swap rounds, as you would expect. It didn't last long as Farina pretty quickly was back past Hawthorne, in rainy conditions, I should mention, to retake 2nd, putting Ferrari back in a 1-2-4 position. Hawthorne splitting them, and the 3 Gordinis now lined up right behind them, having gotten the better of most of their rivals and shuffling them around among themselves. By lap 5, Hawthorne was unable to hold out against any of the Ferraris, and Villarizi made his way into 3rd to establish the Ferrari 1-2-3 once again. Meanwhile, Bianco retired with an axle failure. Actually, the first retirement of the race for once. Relatively late into it, honestly. The local Flinterman followed on lap 8. Meanwhile, Ferrari were pulling away easily. Despite his good qualifying, Hawthorne could do no more than sort of keep up with them in 4th. And the Gordinis were not as fast as him either. Hawthorne really getting the most out of that Cooper this year, and the only Cooper to really show up consistently at almost every race as well. Sterling Moss continuing to work his way up through the field with a pretty lightning drive in the old ERA. By lap 11, Beira, the lead Gordini, was out with an electrical issue. Meanwhile, Moss had made his way into 7th, after Beira's retirement, that is, and was chasing Manzone and Trintignant pretty closely, with the 3 of them battling it out for 5th and the final points-paying position. Retirements continued as the race went on, with Frere going out with a clutch issue, De Tornaco with an engine failure, Downing with a loss of oil pressure. Running dead last, Landy proceeded to give his car over to Jan Flinterman, the retired local. Apparently they had some sort of sharing arrangement in the privateer Maseratis, maybe just a gentleman's request or agreement, given it was Flinterman's home race and all. Most of the race went on in pretty much that order until finally the 3-way battle for 5th came to a close with the unfortunate retirement of Sterling Moss due to an engine failure. He's had several, great drives within the limits of what the ERA is capable of this year, all curtailed by reliability issues. That cooled the fight off a bit. Wharton took over 7th, but then immediately retired as well with a wheel bearing failure. Manzone was able to hold on to 5th ahead of Trintignant, and in the end, After 90 laps, Ferrari claimed another 1-2-3. Ascari once again took the fastest lap. Hawthorne was the best of the rest with 4th place, and Manzone claimed the final points. 9 out of 18 starters actually made it to the line, which is better than the attrition rate at the Nürburgring. With a time of 2:53.28.5, Ascari was 40 seconds clear of Farina, a minute 34 ahead of Villarici, and 2 full laps ahead of Hawthorne, 3 ahead of Manzone. Behind them, Trintignant was also 3 laps down, Hamilton 5, Macklin 6, and the car Flinterman drove to the finish 7. At this point, of course, Ascari had more than the maximum number of points, theoretically up to 45, but he had to drop a full race win with fastest lap. That 4th second place was enough to take Farina past Taruffi in the overall standings, but no chance at all of catching Ascari. Even his real points, never mind his dropped points, even if dropped points were no concern. Completely, Ascari with 5 wins on the trot in an 8-race season in an absolute league of his own. Mike Hawthorne now best of the rest with 10, ahead of Manzone with 9, both of them performing quite well throughout the year, 3 points paying finishes apiece. Then Rudy Fischer should actually have 10 also, so that's a bit of a mistake, but he was in a Ferrari, of course, so that's basically cheating at this point. Villarici finally getting on the board along with Beira. In the constructor standings, Ferrari, of course, with far more than the maximum possible points, even just untouchable. Gordini having the drop points as well, but just more consistent than Cooper over the whole, with thanks to that factory team they were entering in all probability. But Cooper very much still in the fight for that theoretical second place, if they could get a great result in Italy, of course. Easier said than done. Ahead of the season finale, a couple of final non-championship races. The Grand Prix de la Balle would see the Ferraris and Gordinis again face off in France, with Ascari ahead of Manzone, Farina, Villarici, and Trintignant. The result, Ascari won from Villarici, then Rosier in the privateer Ferrari, then Collins in his HWM, and then Gérard Cabontus in his HWM, with the Gordinis just suffering a total defeat. In fact, Beira, Trintignant, and Manzone all retired. Bit of a disaster for them on home turf. And it was on that note that the Italians, having dominated the season in the person of Ferrari, finally made their way home to Monza for the Italian Grand Prix on September 7th, 1952. Built back in 1922 by the Milan Automobile Club, Monza's high-speed ring was still out of use due to some deaths back in 1933. With that not operational this year, it was all but identical to the modern Monza circuit, with the exception of Parabolica was still 2 90-degree corners, and the chicanes hadn't been added yet. Ascari had won it the previous year after a tough fight with the Alfa Romeos. He might have expected to have an easier time of it this year, but after missing most of the season, after the failure of the car at the Nürburgring, Maserati finally appeared with 3 Works A6 GCMs for Gonzalez, Bonetto, and Franco Roll, making up a staggering 35-car entry list. 10 Ferraris, 8 Maseratis, and also 4 Gordinis, 4 Coopers, 3 Connaughts, 3 HWMs, an Oscar, an Aston Butterworth, and a Cisitalia. Now, the Monza authorities also thought that was a rather staggering entry list, and the organizers finally ruled that only the top 24 qualifiers could start, thus creating what I believe is the first World Championship. It's not exactly pre-qualifying, but the first qualifying that actually determined whether you qualified to participate in the race? Sure, let's call it that. Not exactly pre-qualifying, because it was all in one session. Anyway, only the top 24 out of the 35 cars were allowed to actually start the race. So there was more than pride and grid spots at stake during qualifying. The Ferraris, as you might expect, had no trouble, at least not the leaders. Ascari took pole with a 2:05.7, 12.5 seconds slower than his time from the previous year, but more than enough for pole this year. Sorry, I was just checking whether it was actually Ascari's time the previous year. No, it was actually Fangio's time the previous year. My bad. That being said, he was actually 14.4 seconds slower than his time from the previous year, which doesn't make it better as far as the cars having slowed down a lot in 52 goes. Then Villarizi, Farina. Villarizi beating Farina this time out, so finally properly recovering from his injuries and getting back into the groove of things, perhaps. Trintignant, the leading guard, Gordini. On the second row, Gonzalez, the pompous bull, managed to put his brand new Maserati only 1.9 seconds behind Ascari. Maybe not what Maserati were hoping for, but a lot closer than they had been before, and a little bit of hope. But then Taruffi in the fourth works Ferrari. The old man decided to enter all of them, considering it's the home race and all. Manzone in his Gordini, Simon in a fifth works Ferrari. The third row, Sterling Moss in a Connaught Leah Francis, probably easily the most competitive car he'd driven, not only all year, but probably in his whole career of entering World Championship races, which he'd entered a few in previous years, spottily. Eli Bayol in the Oscars, qualifying surprisingly well in a car that's barely a footnote generally. Beira in the last works Gordini, and then Hawthorne in his Cooper, only 12th, but a very tight field by the standards of 1952, with only 5.5 seconds separating the top 12. Behind them, Bonetto, also in the new Maserati, Fischer in his privateer Ferrari, Wharton in his Cooper, Roll in his Maserati, another of the new ones, Rosier in his privateer Ferrari, Landy in his older Maserati, Poor in a Connaught, Brandon in a Cooper. Oh yes, and notice how badly Moss beat the established Connaught drivers in qualifying here. And on the last row, Alan Brown in his Cooper, McAlpine in his Connaught, Cantoni and Bianco in their privateer Maseratis were the last ones to actually manage to make the 24 starters. Out, not making the cut, would be De Tornaco and his Ferrari, Crespo and de Graffenried in their old Maseratis, Collins in his HWM, Whitehead in his Ferrari, Gaze in his HWM, Aston in his Aston Butterworth, Macklin and his HWM, Hans Stuck in a privateer Ferrari, Piero Duccio in the Cis Italia, and Claes in the old Gordini. To be fair to the HWMs, I believe they were some of the most down on power out of them all with those Alta engines. And the Cooper Bristol engines were a bit more powerful, as were the Leah Francis engines that the Connaughts were using. So on a track that was pure power then, even more than it is now, the HWMs were just totally out of their element. As the race started, however, well, nothing is guaranteed, especially with the attrition of the time, and all three of the lead Ferraris started very well. Ascari started a bit badly. Villarizi and Farina both started very badly, while the Gordinis and Maseratis all started rather brilliantly, with Gonzalez leaping from 5th directly into the lead off of the second row. Granted, that is only the second row at the time. Eli Bayol and his Oscar, after qualifying so well, were immediately out with a gearbox failure on the grid. Taruffi dropped several places as well. Bonetto had a brilliant start, gaining 7 places on his way down to Curva Grande. 2 rows. very solid. The result, by the end of the first lap, Gonzalez led from Ascari, then Trintignant, Manzone, and Beira in their Gordinis, Bonetto in his Maserati, and Villarizi, Farina, Taruffi, and Simon in the other works Ferraris were having to make their way up from 7th and beyond towards the front. Within a few laps, Fischer became the first, Biol had been the first retirement, Fischer the second. Gonzalez was demonstrating that he actually had the pace to pull away from, or at the very least match, but in fact to pull away from Ascari at this early stage, but the Maserati did not have the fuel mileage that the Ferrari did, and like the Connaughts in Britain, would have to make a fuel stop, so Gonzalez had to make a large gap on Ascari to deny him the victory here. Villarizi, meanwhile, was pushing hard to recover successfully. Farina, Taruffi, and Simon a bit less successfully. By lap 5, McAlpine was out with a suspension failure, while Hawthorne, who had not qualified or started especially well in his underpowered car, which none of the British cars had brilliant horsepower at this point, had to come into the pit for prolonged repairs, which pretty much ended any chance of him getting anything out of the race. In fact, when I say prolonged, he had a ignition problem but ended up remaining in the pit lane for a full hour before finally emerging to continue racing, a mere 40 laps down, still going for it. No thought of parts saving in 1952. Unfortunately, the blows began to fall for Ferrari's rivals as on lap 6, Trintignant was out with an engine failure. Villarizi having already passed Bonetto, Beira, and Manzone, that brought him up to third, not far behind Ascari. And in fact, to perhaps the shock of the Ferrari faithful and the watching world in general, not that it was on TV at the time, Villarizi proceeded to slipstream his way past Ascari and take second place. A very slipstream-heavy track, of course. Meanwhile, Manzone and Bonetto were both slowly slipping backwards, but Beira was able to hold his position despite the slowly recovering pack of deadly and powerful Ferraris behind. So Ascari found himself in second, and more or less accepted that, preferring to slipstream Villarizi, and both of them pursuing Gonzalez, knowing, I believe, that he would have to make a pit stop. So as the race went on, Franco Roll was the next out with an engine failure in his Maserati. Bonetto had slipped back to ninth in his new Maserati. At this point, Gonzalez was the only real hope for the non-Ferrari crews, and especially for Maserati. But he was still in first, still increasing his advantage on Villarizi and Ascari as the race ticked past its quarter-way mark, really driving very well. Beira was also fighting for it, much more so than Manzone anyway, but not quite fast enough in the long run to beat the Ferraris, perhaps. And, well, any chance that he was going to get it ended by lap 30, as in pretty quick succession, Beira and Taruffi both developed significant mechanical problems. Meanwhile, Simon suffered a bit of an odd loss of pace, maybe in part, maybe he lost the slipstream from Beira and Taruffi, but anyway, his pace dropped off rather abruptly, and Manzone, Farina, and Bonetto, after struggling so far, were able to make their way back up towards the points positions. It was on lap 36 that Gonzalez made his fuel stop. Villarizi, having gotten into second and pursued him, had chewed up his tires in the process of that fight back and had to also make a pit stop, meaning Alberto Ascari found himself suddenly leading, albeit with a probably very fast Gonzalez and Villarizi likely to be coming back at him in the second half of the race. Manzone was briefly as high as second, given the pit stops for Gonzalez and Villarizi, but on lap 43 had to pit for new spark plugs and proceeded to lose several laps, which, even at this time, knocked him. He actually lost about 10 laps, which knocked him thoroughly out of contention, even in 1952. Gonzalez and Villarici, meanwhile, were both as rapid as expected, with a fresh load of fuel in one case and new tires in the other. Beira was out with an engine failure, so between that retirement and Manzone's issues, Gordini was officially out of it. For all practical intents and purposes, it was between Ferrari and Maserati. And Gonzalez was very fast that day. On lap 45, he made his way past Farina into second and set off in pursuit of Ascari. In fact, it didn't take long. Farina did not quite have the pace, and it didn't take long for Villarici on his new tires to also pass Farina, basically chasing after Gonzalez and also Ascari. Bianco was out with an engine failure, although he had the older Maserati. As the race went on, Moss, having gotten himself into 8th, had to retire once again with his suspension failure, which must be, let me check, it must be about his 4th or 5th. In fact, it's his 5th mechanical retirement of the year. 1 in an HWM, 3 in the ERA, and now 1 in the Connaught. Terrible, terrible luck for Sterling Moss this year. Meanwhile, Ascari was doing no more than matching Gonzalez, but that was in itself just about enough, of course. Gonzalez was behind by quite a margin still. Fuel stops were not fast in 1952. And Gonzalez's chances to catch up were just not quite, were slipping away with every lap that passed by. In the end, he couldn't quite bring it home. After 80 laps, Ascari won by about a minute, which really is very little more than a 1952 pit stop. If Maserati could fix their mileage issue, that is their fuel consumption issue, then they might have been right in it. As it is, they break up the Ferrari podium rather decisively for the first time all year, with Ascari winning from Gonzalez and then Villarici, then Farina. Bonetto also taking 5th in his Maserati in the end, having worked his way past Simon and Taruffi. No, Taruffi worse than Ferrari's reserve driver, Simon. Not sure. Maybe the morale hit of getting briefly demoted, but not having a good finish. Not really even having a good year compared to any of his teammates. At least Farina had mechanical troubles to blame for some of his issues, but not great by Taruffi, really. It does bear mentioning that Ascari managed to set exactly the same time. Well, granted, they were only timing to tenths of a second, but still pretty impressive. Ascari and Gonzalez set times of 2 minutes, 6.1 seconds each, 4/10 slower than Ascari's pole time, to share the fastest lap point, taking a half point each. So Ascari won by a minute, 1.8 over Gonzalez, 2 minutes, 4 over Villarici, 2:11 over Farina, and a lap ahead of Bonetto in the other Maserati. And this very much bodes well for 1953. After a 52 totally dominated by Ferrari, Maserati still have some teething troubles. Their car is far from perfect, but they brought a much, much closer fight to Ferrari than anybody else had during the year. Other finishers, Simon 1 lap down, Taruffi 3, Landy and Wharton 4, Rosier and Cantoni 5, Poor 6, Brandon 7, Manzone 9, Brown 12. You'll notice Mike Hawthorne was not actually classified in the end, as he finished 42 laps behind Ascari. So the final World Drivers' Championship standings for 1952. Alberto Ascari won the final 6 races of the season in a row after missing the first and retiring from the second. 36 points, of course, the maximum score, but if there hadn't been dropped points, he would have had an unchallengeable 53.5. The only blemish, really, being that half point Gonzalez stole off of him by splitting the fastest lap in Monza. Farina takes second in the end with 24 counting points, 27 in all. Just about beating out Taruffi, who took 22. Then Fisher and Hawthorne with 10 each. Thanks to his second, Fisher is classified higher, so it's a Ferrari 1, 2, 3, 4 in the World Drivers' Championship. Hawthorne best of the rest, just ahead of Manzone. Ruttman of the Indy 500. Villarizi, 2 third places in a row to end the season. Quite solid. Seems safe to think that if he hadn't been injured, he probably would have done better than Taruffi and would have been very closely matched with Farina over the season anyway, but still would have been well behind Ascari. Gonzalez, also a great result at the final race, but not quite great enough to actually beat the Ferraris, which of course won every race except the Indy 500. John Beira picked up 6. And other drivers in the points. Wharton, Poor, Brown, Trintignant, Freire, Bonetto, Thompson. As far as the unofficial constructors, Ferrari would win, of course, all races this season, 36 points, 62.5, as neither Gordini nor Cooper scored at the final race. Gordini will unofficially take the Best of the Rest award with 13 counting points, or 15 in total. Cooper only 12. Maserati pick up, of course, 6.5 at the final race, but their inability to have a car ready for the whole season, well, Ascari's feat is magnificently impressive, but Maserati's inability to have their car ready at the start of the year meant that, of course, the season was basically a Ferrari walkover with nobody remotely close to challenging them. Other points go to Fraser Nash, Connaught, the old Simca Gordinis, and HWM. I should mention a couple of the season. The single-seater season did not necessarily end entirely at Monza. There were a couple of final non-championship races, such as the Gran Premio de Modena on September 14th, which saw the Ferraris of Ascari, Villarizi, and Farina once again up against Gonzalez's Maserati, and a similar result as, well, Ascari retired, also Manzone and his Gordini. Ascari managed to take third after taking over the Ferrari of Sergio Siganolfi, still beating out Farina, who was only fourth, and Fisher fifth. As you can see, Villarizi beat Gonzalez to the line to win, albeit apparently in a dead heat, as the times are reported as being 0.0 seconds apart, and Villarizi was basically eyeballed to have won the finish. It obviously wasn't precisely recorded and wasn't a world championship race, but it must be one of the tightest finishes in the whole history of top-level single-seater racing. There are a couple of extraordinarily close ones later on in Formula One history as well, of course, but would have been something to see anyway. So, we reached the end of the season. Ascari frankly dominated, having won 6 in a row. Only he and Farina had actually managed to finish 5 out of 8 races in the points, which sort of justifies the decision to have only the top 4 results actually count, since only 2 drivers had to drop any points. Ascari out-qualified Farina 5-1, Taruffi 4-0. Farina also beat Taruffi 5-0 while going 1-1 with Villarizi. Essentially the same story in the race, 5-0 and 4-0 to Ascari, 3-0, and then 1-1 to Farina. The idea is pretty clear. Ferrari's drivers had a very clear order in terms of speed, and that was Ascari, then Farina, then Taruffi, with pretty significant gaps in between them, really. Villarizi and Farina were pretty closely matched, but a very small sample size, with Villarizi only returning at the end of the season. Next season promises to be quite a lot more. I don't want to say the season was uninteresting, but 1953 promises to be much more competitive. We'll see the introduction of the first non-European race, with F1 heading to Argentina, albeit it's still F2, technically speaking. Fangio making his return after his year off with injury this year in the Maserati to take the fight to Ascari and Ferrari, the fight that they didn't have this year. And Mike Hawthorne, after his outstanding year this year, the best of the non-Ferraris, stepping up to take a seat at Ferrari as their sort of non-Italian driver, and frankly, on the basis of the evidence of this season, surely a better choice than Taruffi, really. But you'll have to come back next time for that. Thank you for listening, everyone. This has been Admiralty Racing's history of the 1952 Formula One season. See you next time.